morning everybody. Okay, so I am running little behind what I had planned, but it's okay. What I will try to do today is sort of give you some very generic overview about some of the things which we can do using statistics in this problem of estimating parameters from given data. So if you recall, what we have done so far is essentially the problem is we are given some values of x variables which we can call as independent variables and some dependent variables y variables. We want to obtain unknown parameters theta of a model, and what we have said is really if the model is linear in the parameters, we can get this solution A transpose A inverse A transpose Y by various approaches, various means. Okay. And I have tried to motivate the fact that look, even if you know this solution, you cannot stop there. Really your work starts once you have this solution. You have to answer various questions for which a statistical interpretation analysis is required. Okay. So really this is the motivation for why we should have a course on regression in a postgraduate curriculum. So I will try to just sort of now in this particular handout give you an overview of what sort of insights we can bring using statistics to this problem. So let's just let me look at this problem again, sort of frame it. Now let's try to frame it using statistical ideas. So again similar problem, I mean a simple linear regression problem. You want to regress the dependent variable. In this case this data is taken from this book and it actually is data for actual cars. So there is a data set which involves maybe 20-25 cars, different types of cars, and for each car some experiment is performed to obtain the mileage, okay, number of miles traveled per liter or per gallon, and this is the size of the engine. Okay, I don't recall the units, but in maybe in liter or some in cc, centimeter cube, yeah, or cubic inches in inch cube. Yeah, centimeter cube it was appearing too small, 500. It's cubic inches. So this is the for various cars. Okay, so this data is given to you, and if you see the trend of this, as the size of the engine increases, the mileage goes down. Okay, the car uses more fuel. Now some car engineer claims that, so you want to say whether this mileage is a function of the displacement or not. Car engineers claims that look, they have this type of relationship. So this is your x and this is your y. Okay, they are related by a straight line relationship, and the problem for you is to find those parameters. So again the same parameter estimation problem. However, now when we start looking at the statistical insights or try to put a statistical framework, so basically we start with this observation that given the data set, no matter what you try, you cannot fit a straight line that passes through all the points. Okay, so here now the thing is straight line has been fixed for you. You can only fit a straight line. Okay, but whatever you do, straight line does not pass through all the points. So this is one particular straight line fitted. Okay, it does not pass through all the points. But that person keeps on insisting that no, it is a straight line. Whether your fitted line passes through all the points or not, I don't care. I know it's a straight line relationship. So really so as a mathematician or an engineer, question for us is how do we explain this discrepancy? That guy says it has to be a straight line. We say okay, I cannot fit a straight line which passes through all the points. So essentially that's where we bring in this error term. That relationship is really a straight line plus an error term, and now this error term we start making assumptions on this error term. So essentially we say it's a random variable. Random variable meaning it's a variable whose value you cannot predict. It keeps on changing every time you do an experiment. You can make statements about you can make assumptions or statements about probabilities of this particular variable taking some value. You can say with probability 50% this variable will be between 0 and 1. You can make such statements maybe. Yeah. So like tossing a coin. If I toss a coin, I don't know what value it will take, but I can say if it's a fair coin, 50% probability is that I will get a head, right? So that's a random variable for you. So we assume that this unexplained part is a random variable which is 0 mean, that is the average value of this. If I generate several values for this random variable, if I average those, the average is 0. Okay. Further we assume that it has a normal, often we assume, let me quantify this, often assumed in regression that it has a normal or a Gaussian distribution which is the bell shaped curve. Okay. So if we so with this interpretation, we can actually go ahead with this framework, rather with this assumptions on the error, we can go ahead and now do a lot of further analysis. Okay. So this is the again the raw data, and this is the regression line that you fit using that A transpose A inverse A transpose Y. These are the estimates of intercept and slope. Okay. Now, because that epsilon, the error term, we had said is a random variable, okay, which means that it does not take a fixed value all the time. Every time we do an experiment, it changes. As a consequence of that assumption, whatever estimates you are getting over here, okay, for the given observations, these crosses, these estimates are also random variable, okay, because they are functions of the observations yi's that you have, A transpose A inverse A transpose Y, and as that error changes, your observations change, and as a result your estimates will also change. Okay. So essentially I will show you some plots, but I will tell you what I mean by this statement. So essentially what we are saying is, even if I were to repeat the experiment at the same x values, the errors epsilon will change, which in turn will lead to different estimates. Okay. So you fix that inch cube, you take the same car, one person drives, he says the mileage is okay, 20 kilometers per liter, let's say, or whatever in that units. Other guy drives a car, he says it's 25. Okay, so the x is the same, the engine displacement is the same, but your y keeps on changing at the same x. Essentially we explain that by the fact that, look, there is a relationship between engine displacement and mileage which is not changing, the true relationship is not changing, yet my y is changing because these epsilons are changing. Because my estimates are a function of y, the estimates themselves will change, even though the truth has not changed. Of course the truth is unknown to me, the true values are unknown to me. Okay. So really we want to use this idea, so this interpretation, so to give a confidence interval on the true parameters. So the fact that these numbers can change, then how do I report these values to you? If I say, if I report the values as this and this, tomorrow you may repeat the experiment and you may find that this guy has changed, it has become 60, this guy has become plus 5. Okay, so what's the reliability of those numbers? Okay, I mean what's the what confidence you have in those numbers? So what we want to do is not just report these are called as point estimates, not just report these point estimates, but based on them and based on some analysis also tell you, look, because I know this guy keeps changing, the true parameter can somewhere be in some range, so that's called a confidence interval. Okay, so this is what we want to do using the statistical insights, and then we also want to use the developed model, whatever model we are developing, whatever model we are obtaining, to say, okay, if now you drive a car with engine displacement of 500 inch cube, what is the corresponding mileage that you will get? So essentially predict the future. Okay, and when I say predict the future, you again just don't want to predict the point value, but also give a range, because it will be impossible to accurately predict the single number. And last thing we may want to do is that really check the assumptions of that engineer itself. Was he right in insisting on a straight line model, or would some other model have been better? Okay, so is this model adequate or not? Okay, these are some of the things that we may want to do, or we can do, if we use if we start looking at the problem as a problem in statistical parameter estimation, I mean involving random variables. Okay, so to illustrate some of these ideas, what I have done is, I just see in this example, or see that's the thing in any real data, you really don't know the truth, because whatever these observations are, they are experimental observations. Okay, somebody did some experiments and observed and noted those down. So you really do not know what is true relationship, right? So you cannot, to illustrate the ideas, you cannot do it on that example. So but you can do it by simulation. So what I did is, I started with this model, y equal to 4 plus 6x plus epsilon. So now I know the truth, the parameters, the slope, the intercept and the slope are 4 and 6. I'm going to generate data as per this model. So essentially I'm going to obtain 10 values, x takes these values, and I'll obtain the corresponding values of y, but every time this epsilon will keep on changing. This I will obtain from a normal distribution as a random variable with 0 mean and some variance. Okay, so I perform this experiment once. So for me, one data set means I have performed experiment once means I have generated 10 values of y corresponding to these 10 values of x. And how are they generated? Generated by this model. And what happens when I generate using this model? This epsilon keeps on changing, because that's a random variable. Every time I repeat the experiment, okay, So essentially I am going to repeat the experiment 5000 times. What does it mean 5000 times? I will have 5000 sets of y for these values of x. Okay, so this part essentially will take the same set of values. Once for x equal to 2, this part will be 4 plus 12, 16. For x equal to 1, it will be something. This part will remain fixed for all those 5000 times, but because of this epsilon, what you are going to measure will keep on changing. So you have 5000 data sets you have, each data set being of consisting of 10 observations, fine. And once you have a data set, okay, you can estimate the parameter for that data set. Now because you are doing this 5000 times, you will have 5000 estimates of intercept and slope, okay, and we want to look at how those estimates change. So this what you see in this plot, this is a histogram of the true errors, the epsilons, which in this case I generated using MATLAB and added to that 4 plus 6x, okay. So the error, if you really, so here these are the values of the error, and essentially this range, it takes a value from maybe -6 to +4. The y-axis tells you the frequency in any particular bin. On the x-axis we have divided it into 10 bins, okay. So you can see that, so total how many errors I have generated, essentially 5000 into 10. So 50,000 error values are generated. So this is the histogram of those 50,000 values. So approximately 16,000 of those are in this bin with the highest height, okay, maybe between, I don't know, -0.5 to +0.5 or whatever that is, okay. So this is the histogram of the true errors, okay, and what you see over here is now the histogram of your estimated intercepts. You had 5000 data sets, so every time you are doing this parameter estimation, so you have now 5000 estimates of intercepts. The true intercept we know is 4, that is not changing, but your estimate keeps on changing. This is the histogram of your estimated intercepts. So you sometimes even have got intercept as low as maybe this is 1.5 or 1.6 up to 1, and you have got intercept as high as 7, okay. But it ranges in this range 1 to 7, but lot of those intercepts are around 4. This height is 4. And what you can also make out from this histogram is that if you roughly take an average of all those 5000 intercepts that you got, you will get a number close to 4, okay. So in a single experiment, you can actually get essentially any value based on this histogram. So this sort of gives you an idea of how those intercepts are distributed, okay. So when I say statistical interpretation, this is what essentially is happening. Every time you do the experiment again, the truth has not changed, but your estimates are changing, okay. What you are getting, okay, so I'll get back to it later. So this is for the intercept, and this is for the, similarly for the slopes. The true value of the slope is 6, okay. What you are getting is any number from 5.6 to 6.6, and then so many, maybe 1500 values are in this particular bin, which corresponds to maybe 5.95 to 6.05, okay. So again this has 5000 intercepts. So this is what we mean when we say that whatever you are estimating intercept and slope, that's a random variable. That is, every time you repeat the experiment at the same set of x values, okay, your estimates are changing even though the truth has not changed. And why that is happening is because that epsilon guy, that's the culprit, okay, that epsilon is changing every time, okay, and that essentially models reality. That's how it's going to happen in reality, okay, because straight line is just an idealization. There is some other factors which affect your mileage which are not being modeled, all that are getting lumped in that epsilon, okay. The last plot, if you see just here, so we had those 5000 into 10, 50,000 values of the errors, and what I have plotting over here on the y-axis is the estimated errors, the 50,000 estimated errors, the residuals, with your theta hat, okay. What are the fit errors, okay. So you do an experiment, you fit a line, so for you the estimate of the errors are the deviation between these crosses and the straight line, so whatever these vertical heights are, okay. So the truth versus these are your estimates of the errors. So you are plotting, we are plotting those in this particular plot, and for a well behaved model you would expect that these two should be close to each other, and you can say that they are close if you roughly see they by and large Okay, the scales are slightly different. This is -5 to 4, this is -4 to +4, but by and large they lie on a 45-degree line. Okay, most of the data lies on a 45-degree line, so they are equal. Okay, of course this was simulation where we knew the truth. We could do all of this. Yeah, but in reality, you will never know the true errors or the true parameters. Okay, so you don't know that. Rarely will the experiments be repeated large number of times. So here I repeated the experiment 5,000 times. I mean, mostly you will have one set of runs. That's it. Okay. So the question for us is that all this analysis has to be performed, or some insights have to be gained just based on one set of experimental values. We have one data set that we have. So those, let's say for x, 10 values of x, we have one set of y values. Okay. We want to perform that analysis based on only one set of generated values. So without going too much into how to obtain this, what we can actually do is we can actually do a lot of things with that one set of data. So for this simulated experiment, if I were to just work with one set of data, so not with 5,000, just with one set of 10 observations, the estimates are this of my parameters using that A transpose A inverse A transpose Y. So my intercept is 2.96, slope is 6.06. These are the estimates. Remember that for this case, the truth we know is 4 and 6. Okay, but using this and those fit errors, okay, really the fit errors is what helps us in doing that analysis. Using these errors, the estimated residual, the deviation between this x and our fitted line, okay, using that we can also say that, look, this is my estimate of the intercept and the slope, but I know this can change if you change the data set. However, for your true parameter, so again notice the difference in the notation, beta 1 indicates the true parameter and hat indicates your estimate. I don't know the truth parameter, I mean in the simulation case I know, but if you just give me the data I would not know it. So while my estimate of intercept and slope is this, based on this estimate as well as the fit errors that I am getting, the residuals, I am 95% sure that the true parameter is in this range. The true intercept is in this range and the true slope is in this range, 5.8 to 6.32. So these are called as confidence intervals. Okay, we can generate these intervals. So when I want to report to the person who gave me the data, the experimentalist, apart from reporting these values, I know that these values can change. I also want to report these confidence intervals. Okay, look, my single point estimate is this. However, a 95% confidence on the true value is this range. Okay, so the spread in this, the width of this interval essentially tells you how good your estimate is, how accurate your estimate is. Okay. Now, what does it mean to say that I have, this is a 95% confidence interval? So is there any question on this? Is the idea clear? So how we arrive at this, that is, and that is some details we are omitting. But the idea here is you not only estimate your parameter, but also say something about the true value being in certain region. Okay, the true value could be this. I mean, this is your estimate, but I am 95% sure it could be in certain region. So you are giving this interval. Okay, so these are called as confidence intervals. And see, there is a very nice thing, some very intuitive things. See, this is, so what, okay, what does it mean to say it's a 95% confidence interval? Has anybody done these things or come across? Can anybody sort of try to explain this?
If you repeat these things about 100 samples, about 95 of them will, the actual value will lie in the
Yeah. So yeah, so that's the correct answer. So basically, what is the interpretation of this? That this is 95% confidence interval means that if I were to repeat this experiment, let's say 100 times, okay, so you see what will happen is every time this confidence interval will keep on changing, because every time your true errors will change, these estimates will change, your fit errors, the residuals will also change, your estimated errors. So these confidence intervals will also keep changing. But what will happen is, because it's a 95% confidence interval, 95% of those intervals will actually contain the true parameter 4 and 6. Okay, so this is illustrated in this figure over here. So essentially here I have repeated the experiment 100 times, not 5,000 times. I didn't want to clutter this graph too much. So this, for those x, x could take 10 values, and then you generate the corresponding 10 values for y. That gives you one experiment or one data set. So that way we had 100 data sets, and every time you get your parameters beta 1 hat, beta 2 hat, and you generate a confidence interval. So this is the confidence interval. This is the upper value for the confidence interval, upper limit, and this is the lower limit. Okay, the truth. So this is for the intercept. The truth you know is 4. The truth is not changing. So keep generating confidence intervals. So this is the data set number or the experiment number. The confidence intervals keep moving up and down. Okay. What you know is that because these are all 95% confidence intervals, 95 of approximately 95% of these, or approximately 95 out of these 100 lines will intersect with this horizontal line. Essentially they will contain, these intervals will contain the value 4, roughly 95 of these. So approximately 5 of these intervals will not contain the value 4. So if you see over here this interval, okay, the upper limit is maybe 3.5 and lower limit is 0.5 or so. So this does not contain the true value 4. So there will be roughly 5 such intervals over here. Okay. So that is the meaning of a 95% confidence interval, that if you repeat this process infinite times, 95% of the time whatever interval you are generating will actually contain the true value. Okay. So similarly you can look for the slope. The true value is 6. As you repeat the experiments, generate experimental data sets again and again, because your errors change, your y changes, your theta hat changes, okay, and the fit errors also change, your estimated errors, and your confidence intervals keep on changing. Okay, they move up and down. Also their width can also shrink or expand, but the interpretation is that 95 of these 100 will contain the true value 6 now, if it is for the slope, and about 5 will not contain the true value. Okay. So the point is that whenever you do an experiment, you, after doing your A transpose A inverse A transpose Y, that gives you your estimates theta hat, the point estimates, you also need to generate a confidence interval, okay, so that the experimentalist can get some idea of how accurate your estimates are. Okay. Additional thing that we want to do in regression, or we can do using once we start putting a statistical interpretation, a statistical framework on this problem, additional thing we can do is this. Sometimes for a particular x you also want to predict what is the value of y going to be, and as far as prediction is concerned, we may be interested in two types of predictions. Okay. So for in that mileage example, I want to say, okay, if my engine is of size 600 inch cube, I can ask two questions. For that value of engine 600 inch cube, what will be the mean response at 600 inch cube? So that I am representing as x naught. So what is the meaning of mean response? That is, if I repeat the experiment many times at this x naught, okay, what will be the average value of y I will get? I know that if I repeat the experiment, see what you know is that if I fix x as, let's say x naught equal to something, let's say 2, I repeat the experiment many times at that x naught, this y will keep on changing because of this error. Okay. If I average them, okay, well, if I had infinite data, really the average will become simply 4 plus 6 x naught, because these are 0 mean, they will all cancel out. But what I have is just one set of runs. Okay. Based on that, I really want to find what is the average response I will get at x, at a particular value of x. That's called as the mean response. Okay. Other thing is an individual prediction. So this you can you may be interested in this, and you may also be interested in this individual prediction at x naught. Individual prediction is, I am going to just do a single experiment at x naught. What is the value of y that I will observe? Okay. Again, one can easily really show that point estimates for both are theta 1 hat plus theta 2 hat x naught. So essentially, see, what we are saying is the following. So if you were to generate just one value of y at x equal to x naught, what will that value be? It will be 4 plus 6 x naught plus whatever value epsilon assumes it takes, right? That will be your individual value. If you had to say what that value would be, what will be your estimate of that value? If you have to predict that value, I tell you x, and I ask you, tell me that individual value that you will get. This is called the future prediction. In future, if I were to repeat an experiment at x naught, what is the value I will observe over here? So what is it that you are going to do? You have an estimate of this. You don't know the truth 4, but you have an estimate of this. You have an estimate of this. This guy anyway you don't know what it will be, but it's 0 mean, so you assume it will be 0, and you can say my prediction will be my estimated intercept plus estimated slope times x0. Okay, that's my predicted value. That's called an individual prediction. Other thing I said was the mean response. What is the mean response? So if you are going to average over here, you keep x fixed, generate many values. X has been fixed at x naught. Now for individual observations, epsilon keeps on changing, but when you average them, these epsilons will all cancel out. So if I now ask you, what will be your estimate of that mean response? For you, you do not know the truth. All you have is the estimate here, and you know the value of x. You simply compute this part, theta 1 hat plus theta 2 hat x naught, and that's an estimate for the mean response as well. Okay. So these are called as the point estimates. The point estimates for both are this theta 1 hat plus theta 2 hat x naught. Okay. However, you can also do something more. You can also give confidence interval. See, the thing is, if you knew that because you do not know theta 1, what you know is only theta 1 hat, and this theta 1 hat keeps on varying. As a result, this is your estimate, but the true mean response or the true prediction will actually be different than this. So now you can also give an interval. I think you will get this value, but I am 95% sure that the value can be in this range. You can generate the same thing for these predictions. Okay. So if I were to show you, maybe the figure will make it clearer. So this is the same data, that mileage data which we had, and what I am showing you in this plot are some curves. So if you see this plot, the x's are the given data, the green line is your regression line using your A transpose A inverse A transpose Y, right? And now you see the red curve. See, what is this red curve? Red curve is actually a confidence interval on the mean response. What it says is, let's say if I fix, let's say x equal to 200, okay, if I were to drive many cars for which x, the engine displacement is 200, I'll keep getting different values of the mileage. Okay, but if I were to average all those, what is the value I get? Well, I don't really know, but my estimate of that value is whatever is the corresponding value in the green line. That's my regression line, and I'm 95% sure that the average value at 200 will be between the corresponding red lines. Okay, this height is your 95% confidence interval at x equal to 200. At x equal to 250, you have some other confidence interval. So you're generating a confidence interval on mean response. Fine. See, whatever is on the green line is just a point prediction, just a single value, but it does not tell me how accurate your estimate is. It's really the width of this line which gives me an idea that is your line really worth it. I mean, can I really use your line to say what will happen if I do the experiment at certain x again? Okay. So this is the mean response, and what you see on the black lines, however, is the what is called as the prediction interval. So you can think of it as 95% confidence interval on individual response. If I were to do one experiment at 200, okay, what is the value I will get? Hey, again, I don't know what's the value you will get, but my estimate of that value is whatever is the value on the green line, and I am 95% sure that that one experiment at x equal to 200 will be between the black lines. So there is an average, mean response, and there is an individual prediction. You can generate confidence intervals for both these quantities. Okay, so when you report the data back to the experimentalist, okay, it's not okay to, it's not adequate. Well, I should not say okay. It's not enough to just report this green line. Apart from the green line, you should also report these two curves, the red lines, the pair of red lines, as well as the pair of black lines. Okay, this essentially you can use it for prediction, or you can say if I were to do an experiment at 500, the average will be somewhere in this between these red lines, but the individual value could be anywhere in this range. So maybe between 17 or to maybe 4 or 6. Okay. So it actually gives you how accurate your predictions will be by looking at these widths. Also, it's not very, probably not very obvious in this. Do you notice anything? But do you notice anything in the what is the shape of this? These two red lines? It's increasing. So it actually increases quadratic. Where is the width the smallest? Roughly it's the smallest over here. And what's the special thing about this over here? This region for x? This is roughly the average of your x values. So you had 10 values for x. Okay. You did 10 or 20, 23 in this case. You did experiment in this range. Okay. Somewhere over here is the average values of those x, x bar. Okay. Your confidence intervals are the smallest at x bar. So you have the most confidence in making a prediction at a value of x which is equal to x bar. And as you move away from x bar, you move in this direction or this direction, these confidence intervals are increasing. And actually, if you look at the equations, which I don't have it have it here, but you can look at the notes in any textbook, you will find that these actually increase quadratically. The width increases as a quadratic function of the distance from x bar. So which means that if I were to use the model, so that means my model is the most accurate at the center of the data. Okay. And as I move away, so supposing you collected data in this range, maybe 100 to 500, but you want to predict some value of y for x equal to 10. There these confidence intervals would have become even wider. So it's essentially telling you that, look, you use the model to extrapolate, fine, all right, your line can be extended to minus infinity and plus infinity, okay, or rather plus infinity and minus infinity, okay, but the quality of your prediction will keep deteriorating because your intervals keep becoming bigger and bigger. Okay, so that actually gives you an insight. If you just give me the value which this line predicts, that doesn't tell me anything, that how good that prediction is, fine. So the same thing can be done for when you have more than one regressor. See, here we had just one x variable. This is the yield example which I had taken in, I think, in the first class. So your y variable is the yield, and you have two x variables, temperature of the reaction, the reactor, and the pressure. So the same ideas of mean response, that prediction, individual prediction and their confidence interval carries over. I can probably show you it in this plot. It probably appears better. So what you have here is, if you see the surfaces, these points are the given raw data. The middle surface, okay, middle surface, this one is your fitted hyperplane, okay, and the next two surfaces, this one and this one, the top and the bottom over here, this is the confidence interval on the mean response, and this topmost and the bottommost are the confidence interval on the individual prediction. And probably you can rotate it or something. Oops. You can see it over here. This is how it's looking like. The x are your raw observations. This center curve, it's now actually going inside the board. This is your fitted hyperplane, and these two planes, okay, well, these are not really planes, these are again quadratic surfaces, okay. The height over the width of these, distance between these two surfaces gives you a width of your confidence interval at a particular combination of x1 and x2, fine. And again, these are curved surfaces, this one and this one. So as we move away from the center of the data, okay, center is x1 center and x2 center, your heights will, the widths will keep on increasing, okay. So you have the mean response surfaces, the confidence interval on mean response surfaces and the confidence interval on the individual predictions, this one and this one, okay. Fine. So these are some of the things which can be done. You get your parameters, you give a confidence interval on the, so you get your estimates of the parameters theta hat using A transpose A inverse A transpose Y, okay. You get a confidence interval on the true parameters, and then you get the confidence intervals on the mean response as well as the individual predictions. Once you give all of this, then you can say, okay, partly your job is done. However, there is one more thing you can do. I mean, if the experimentalist believes that, look, my model, I know it's a straight line model, then that's it, your job is done. However, the model itself is based on some just a trial and error model. There is no reason to suspect, there is no reason to say that, okay, it has to be a straight line. Okay, maybe you are trying different models. Okay, you don't know what is the true relationship. In that case, you may also want to say whether, so apart from doing all the other analysis, you may also want to say, look, whether the model itself was good or not. Can I test the adequacy of the model, assess the correctness or the quality of the model? Okay, so for this, there are 2-3 criteria which are popularly used. One is something called as R square. Essentially depends on the estimates of those errors, those residuals. If those are small, your R square will be large. So again, this various softwares, if you use, they will actually generate the value for this R square. But this is not just the only criteria. If your curve passes through all the points, then this R square will be 1. Okay. So you should have a high R square, but more importantly, you want to look at those residuals. See, whatever are your fit errors, okay, whatever are these errors, the distance between these x and the green line. If your model is correct, if your assumed model form, in this case a straight line, is correct, then whatever are these fit errors, these are also called as residuals or estimates of the true errors, they should actually represent the properties that you assumed about the true error epsilon in the first place. Okay, you assumed epsilon was 0 mean. Okay, so these residuals, well, in regression these residuals will turn out to be 0 mean. If you take their average of all these deviations, it will be 0, provided you have an intercept in the model. But that's one thing. Other thing is, you assume the residuals are coming from a normal distribution or a Gaussian distribution. So you want to check whether they are also looking Gaussian or not. These your fit errors. Okay. Further, we often assume that these errors are independent. That is, whatever error I am going to get when I am doing experiment now is independent of errors I got in the past. Okay, whether these residuals are appearing to be independent or not. Okay, so you have to do this residual analysis. Largely, these are visual and qualitative criteria. So there is no hard and fast. I mean, it's there are no like black and white tests. Okay, you do this test. If this is satisfied, then yeah, your model is good. If this test is not satisfied, your model is bad. So that's where really the softwares don't help us. They can generate all these plots and so on for us. Okay, but we still need to interpret those plots. Okay, there are often no simple binary answers. Okay, other thing you want to ensure is that whatever confidence intervals that you obtain for the true parameter should not include 0. Essentially, if it includes 0, what you are saying is that I am saying the value is 1.5, but the true value could have been 0. Well, if it had been 0, you better not put that corresponding x variable in the model, right? So that your estimate really is so that particular independent variable is not significantly affecting the dependent variable based on the data that you have observed. Okay, so if your model is the confidence interval on any parameter in your model is including 0, that means your model is not proper. Either you need to generate more data and re-estimate the parameters, or you need to add some more some terms or delete some terms or modify your model. Fine. So sort of summarizing this work, the statistical analysis is essential to answer several important questions in parameter estimation, some of which I try to highlight in this particular presentation. And really the work starts after you have an initial model. So if you assumed a straight line, you got your parameter estimates. Now you have reached level 0. Now that's where now statistics will start. Okay, reaching level 0, as we saw yesterday, could be done through various insights. Okay. There are several tools out there in literature. Okay, they will generate all sorts of things for you, but still you need to exercise judgment. You need to carefully assess the plots or the numbers that are generated. Still there is no, I mean, it's still to some extent it remains an art, and there is no perfect algorithmic way of saying, giving answers yes or no. Okay. With this, I'll move over to the next topic, so which is on design of experiments. So are there any questions on this? Yeah. Well, whether they are biased or consistent, that depends on the method you are using to estimate. So see, again, really it boils down to in this case depends on how I generate the error. See, this A transpose A inverse A transpose Y you get when your errors, well, it will lead to consistent and unbiased estimate provided your errors are behaving in a certain way. You assume them to be normal. If they are normal, okay, well, unbiasedness probably is a much easier property that can be achieved even if there are some, the two errors are not behaving the way you assume, but consistency is another thing that will probably require more rigorous, that your assumption should match the truth about the errors. But it's not a function of confidence interval, it's really the function of the technique. So yesterday, if you recall, I talked about the weighted least squares and the, very briefly had mentioned, see, when we were looking at the optimization inside, we said, look, one objective could be minimizing the sum of squares of those deviations, other could be minimizing the weighted sum of squares of those deviations, with wi greater than 0 being the weights. If you use this or if you use this, you will get different estimates. Okay. In this case, this will give you A transpose A inverse A transpose Y, and this will have a weighting matrix A transpose W A inverse A transpose W Y. So you can construct confidence interval in either case. So then you can ask, so confidence interval is not telling you about anything about unbiasedness. So really, if this is the case, then your ordinary, that A transpose A inverse, so really if the true errors all have the same variance independent of I, that means the weights are all 1, okay, then whatever estimates you get using this, you can say they are the sort of the best possible estimates you can get. Okay. However, the true errors, if they have different variance, wi's are changing, but you use this formulation to obtain your theta, then the estimates that you are getting are not necessarily the best. They may still be unbiased, okay, in this case they will be, but maybe their variance, the confidence intervals will be much larger than what is possible if you use this objective function. Okay. So this, the property that whether they are unbiased or consistent really depends on whether the objective functions which you are using are consistent with the truth. Okay. In the remaining time, next 1.5 half lectures, I want to briefly introduce you to this, the second part of these talks or this problem. So you can say this is now the sort of the design problem. The earlier problem regression was data was already given to us, and maybe we even had a starting model. Okay. We were told that there is a regression, there is a straight line model or some other model, and we wanted to say whether, okay, what are the parameters of that model. Okay. That was primarily the problem. Here you can say this is the dual of that problem is now I want to design the experiments. So typically, so earlier this is what we had done, with the model form was known, and even if model was not known, data points had already been generated by somebody and given to us. Now what we are looking at, the situation we want to look at is this, that we have no idea of model form or even of the variables affecting the response variable y. Is y a function of temperature, pressure, maybe flow rate, maybe something else? What are those variables which I should include in the model? I have no idea. Okay. So in this case, we want to use something called factorial design and its variation. So the idea is we want to generate data in the first place. We want to decide how to do the experiments to generate data based on which we will fit models later on. Okay. So some of which you already know, so probably I will skip over this. So modeling, I will go very quickly over this. Modeling is the problem of developing relationship between variables. You could have theoretical or empirical models. What we are right now working with is empirical models. Okay. So essentially so because these are empirical, these are essentially limited, valid over limited ranges of variables, which we also saw in that straight line regression. As you move away, your actually confidence intervals keep becoming bigger and bigger. Okay. So you want to be careful when you extrapolate. Also, it's very difficult to guess a priori what is the complexity that should be incorporated. However, good design when I say design which generates a data should allow you to consider various types of models and be able to say which model is better or than the other. Okay. So sort of a rule of a thumb you can say is that, okay, so I mean the problem itself you see is really, actually if you look at it, it's actually a chicken and egg type of problem. If you tell me the model, if you tell me it's a straight line model and then say, okay, now at what x should I do the experiment, I can tell you that values of x optimally. Okay, I will be able to perfectly tell you where the experiment should be done because you have told me the model form, it's straight line. Okay, but here I don't know the model form. Okay, I don't know the model form, I have to decide the experimental design. So if I assume some model, I do some experiment, based on that experimental data I fit some model, maybe I have to modify the model which I started with, I change the model, again with that change model I have to generate additional data and keep repeating till I converge. So it's actually a circular problem ideally. Okay, so rule of thumb is, see these are some of these problems you will see are actually they have come from in 60s and 70s, all these things like Taguchi methods, they started becoming popular in quality control and so on. So a lot of these ideas actually have come from, so this is probably one area where it has happened in reverse, not gone from academics to industry. I mean a lot of problems come from industry to academics. So this is one of those areas. Problems, the industry, people who work with industry, they started solving these problems and then the academicians jumped in late, they said okay, we can sort of give a proper framework for this, we can give the theory behind it. So the rule of thumb in industry is that when you do some experiment, you should budget you should budget such that only 25% experimental effort is invested in a first design. So if I tell my boss that look, if I know that it will take me 25 days to maybe get one set of experimental data, I should tell my boss, look, I am going to do this exercise in 100 days. Okay, because after 25 days I will have to do a lot of iterations again and again to improve upon it. Okay, so you get some initial design, you perform experiments, fit some model, then you add or drop variables, change their settings at which you are going to do the experiment and so on. Okay, so to just sort of give a history of this area of experimental design, okay, you can probably divide it into 2 or 3 phases. So really the formal development started with Fisher in 1920s. Fisher was a statistician working in an agricultural research institute. Okay. So in agriculture these ideas are widely used. So you want to maximize the yield of your crops. Okay. So how much fertilizer should I put? How much water should I give? When should I give the water? Okay. When should I give some pesticides? How much pesticides should I give? How do you decide all of that? Right. To get really first principles model is extremely difficult. Right. So agriculture scientists really were very much interested in these ideas, and even now I think these ideas are heavily followed. If you know any agriculture research scientist, you will see that they all rigorously follow these ideas when they do experiments. So Fisher was an agriculture scientist. He introduced some of these concepts of factorial design, analysis of variance and so on. In the process industry, chemical industry as well as mechanical industry, car manufacturing and those sorts of things, electrical electronics industry, George Box co-workers, they introduced some of these ideas in 1950s. Taguchi made it popular in 1970s. Okay, essentially similar ideas but with slight variations. And since then, of course, these ideas are widely used in several industries, and they have become so mature that they have actually now we include them in our courses. But these ideas have become quite mature. Okay. So really, okay, let me skip this. I will really let's sort of give an idea. Let's look at this problem. Okay, which is motivated by an actual problem, even though numbers are fudged. So the problem is of designing a spring. So essentially, there is a company which makes these springs, okay, in a batch. So essentially, they make springs using some process, and as part of that manufacturing process, they have to quench the springs. So the springs are made at a high temperature, and they put them in oil, okay, to cool them rapidly. Okay. Now, so the problem this company was facing is that when in this quenching process, in this cooling process, certain percentage of springs were cracking, and if they crack, you can't sell them. Okay. So really, they wanted to. The problem for them was to how do I eliminate these cracks, okay, in the springs which occur during the quenching process. So just as an initial, just for the initial motivation, let's look at these two factors. We'll add one more later on. So really there are two things which they can vary. One is the temperature of the spring is made of steel. The temperature of the spring when it is quenched, when it is put in the oil, they are operating at this 1525 Fahrenheit. And what is the carbon content of the steel? Okay, steel material, it is 0.6%, let's say, at which they are operating. So they can vary these two parameters, these two variables, and they want to response for them is the percentage of. So let's say they're looking at 100 springs manufactured by one batch. How many of what percent of those cracked? Okay, that's their response variable which they want to minimize. So the whole idea in this design of experiments is here I'm not saying there is a linear model or a quadratic model. We don't know anything. Okay, we don't even know whether these two variables affect or there are some other variables. Okay, so really there are two types of paradigms. In the earlier, the old dogma, the earlier idea was, and still probably several people do it, the earlier idea was that, okay, what will you do in such a situation? Supposing you had to, forget developing a model, supposing, yeah, I mean you just had to identify, okay, whether what is the effect of temperature on cracking or this carbon content on cracking. How would you, what experiments would you do? You are allowed to perturb them from these nominal values, these default values. What is it that you would do if you go to the lab? Yeah? So natural thing would be, okay, I will keep this at 0.6% and increase this temperature, collect data, then decrease this temperature, collect data. Okay, same thing, I'll keep this over here and increase or decrease this and collect data, and from that try to figure out, okay, what is the effect of increasing temperature on cracking or decreasing temperature, and similarly for the carbon content. Okay, so this idea shown in this particular plot. This is your current operating point, let's say, this is where you're operating. You keep, and y-axis indicates the carbon content, x-axis indicates the temperature. You keep carbon content the same, you do an experiment at a higher temperature, another experiment at a lower temperature, and now you keep temperature at the default value and do experiments at a higher carbon content and a lower carbon content. Okay, so essentially you are holding everything constant and only varying one factor or one variable at a time, right? So let's say, just for illustration, the temperature can be varied in this region 1450 to 1600. The default value was, I think, 1525. So this range comes from the process people. They will say, no, you can't change it more than this because I don't know what will happen to my process. So there is an allowable range given to you in which you can vary. Okay, so the lower level is this, upper level is this. Similarly for the carbon content. So this was really the old way of doing things. Okay, and then when Fisher came along, he actually in I think 20s or so he published a paper where he said, no, this is not a good way. Actually you should change all factors simultaneously. Okay, so he popularized this idea, and there was a lot of, if you read literature, apparently his boss had published, essentially his boss was a big supporter of this idea, ki no, this is the way it should be, and he junked that theory and said, no, that's incorrect. Okay, and as the literature says, he did not lose his job, so probably his boss was fair. So the idea in this factorial design is, okay, this is your original point where you are operating. You don't move in this axial directions one factor at a time. Instead you vary both of them together. So again you are doing 4 experiments, but now experiment 1 you have increased temperature and you have increased the carbon content, you are over here. Other experiment you have decreased temperature, increased carbon content, and other 2 combinations. So you still have 4 experiments just like you have done over here, right? But in these 4 experiments you have varied both simultaneously, okay, the carbon content as well as the temperature. So this is called as the factorial design. You are actually perturbing all things together, and it seems counterintuitive that, look, why should this be better? But it turns out that it is indeed better. I will just probably show you, give some hand waving argument of why it is. But just to simplify the notation, let's assume that simply to get rid of the numbers, we will just assume that the lower level, you are given a range for each variable, the lower range I will call it as -1, the upper range as +1, and essentially to get this I will scale the variables. If this is my scaled value, this is my original variable, I will subtract the mean of that, divide by half of the range, the upper value minus the lower value. If I do this, then whenever x is at the lower level, okay, this this particular quantity is essentially the whenever x is, let us say, at the upper level, okay, this will be equal to half of the range, so I will get x as +1, and whenever it is the lower level, this will become minus half of the range, so x will be -1. So essentially I am just scaling the variable, so that now I will say temperature is at -1 +1, carbon content -1 +1, okay. So just to simplify the notation, okay, and this idea is also useful to think in terms of this notation when sometimes you do have qualitative variables. So for example, in chemical industry we work with catalysts. Now there are two different manufacturers of catalysts. So does this catalyst give me a higher yield or this catalyst give me a higher yield? I can't put a number to it. So it's just two different type of catalysts. Okay. So I can call one of them as -1, one of them as +1. Okay. So if you were to look at the regression insight, okay, the way, okay, so if you were to look at fitting a, let us say, a straight line model. So what I want to show you is why that idea of perturbing, changing both the variables together is a better idea than doing things one at a time. So if you just think, okay, if I were to fit a straight line model of the form, let us say there is no slope, just an intercept, okay, so I will ignore the error, so okay, there is error term. If I were to just look at this particular model, okay, why is my percentage of springs cracked? That's a function of my carbon content or the temperature of the spring and the carbon content of the spring. Okay. So how many experiments I am doing? Let's say when I do one factor at a time approach, okay, what were the data values for me, the x1 x2 combinations? If I were to look at the x1 x2 combinations, I had increased x1, so x1 had become +1, okay, and x2 had remained at 0. Then I had decreased x1, x2 still had remained 0, and others I had was x1 was at 0, x2 was at +1, x1 0, x2 was at -1. Okay. This really is my, you can say, if I call this as matrix X, I can write my data set that I have got y1, y2, y3, y4. I have done 4 experiments. Right. Plus I have my error vector. This is really what I am doing in terms of regression, right. I have done experiments at various combinations of x1 and x2, okay, and I have got the corresponding y values, and let us say I now want to estimate beta 1 and beta 2. Okay. This is for the one factor at a time approach. This is my matrix X. Okay. If I were to perturb them together, the factorial design idea, what is my corresponding matrix? See, this matrix X, I am sorry for the notation, this is what we had called as A in regression earlier. Okay. If I were to perturb both the factors together, what is my matrix? I have done experiment where both the variables have increased, so I have +1, +1, right. That is one observation, is that x1 is +1, x2 is at +1, then I have +1, -1, then -1, +1, -1, -1. I have 4 experiments in this. This is your, when you have perturbed all of them together, this is also called as factorial design. Okay. You have this as your data matrix, fine. This is just the data matrix I am assembling for the two cases when you are perturbing one factor at a time and when you have perturbed both of them in all the observations. Okay. If you okay, so this is fine. There are two same 4 experiments you have done in both the cases, but in one case the x values were set at these levels, in other case the x values were set at these levels. Okay, so in both the cases the estimates of beta 1, beta 2 that you will get are going to be different. The model is the same, but you are generating data in different ways, and in each case you are doing 4 experiments. So your experimental effort in that sense is the same. Fine. Question we want to ask is this a better way of generating, or why is this a better way of generating data than this? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, error vector is also there. Yeah, sorry, thanks. Error vector is of course there. So what I am trying to just say is that because this matrix is changing, your estimates are going to be different, and now if they are different, how do you say the estimate obtained from this data set will be different than that obtained from this data set? Okay, I mean how do you say which is better? You really don't know the truth. Okay, so we can say that this is better in the following sense. If you go back to the presentation, so see that this is the X matrix. So error I have just not written for simplicity. Error is always there. See, that goes without saying. Error is always there. You cannot model this perfectly. So this was your one factor at a time approach. Something I just didn't talk about, but what we have seen is what we saw was when you are doing this type of model, then your estimate was x transpose x inverse x transpose y. See, we are using sometimes x, and earlier we were using a over here, and see I was telling you the confidence intervals on the true parameter beta, they all depended on the covariance matrix of this beta hat or the variances in these estimates, and that actually depends on so it's proportional to this matrix x transpose x inverse. So essentially what the result in statistics is, we didn't dwell upon this, is that if this matrix is small, x transpose x inverse is small, then your estimates are better. Okay, so really this matrix governs how accurate how close your beta hat are to the truth. The width of the confidence intervals are governed by entries in this matrix, and you want them to be small. So if you now look at this particular the factorial design problem again, this is what you had done one at a time. This is the X matrix you had got. If you now do X transpose X, this is what you will get, and when you look at its inverse, you get entries 0.5, 0.5, 0, 0. What this tells you, this 0.5, essentially this gives you an idea of the uncertainty that you will have, the variance you will have in your parameter beta 1 hat, and this will tell you the variance in beta 2 hat. Okay. In the factor, so you just take it on the if you have not encountered this before, just take it on the face value that smaller these entries are, the more accurate your estimates are. Okay. So in this case you are getting 0.5, 0.5. However, if you look at this case, for this X matrix where you had perturbed both of them together in every experiment, your X transpose X inverse actually gives you 0.25 and 0.25. So the parameters that you are going to get over here, the estimates, are twice as accurate as the estimates that you get from this. Okay. So this is, I mean, just from these equations, intuitively why should this happen? Again, it sounds counterintuitive, but why it is happening is, if you see this way of doing experiments, the first two runs, the value of y1 and y2 corresponding to these values of x, they contain no information from x2 at all. The second two runs contain no information from x1 at all. Okay. Whereas here all the 4 runs contain information from x1 as well as x2. So essentially to extract out the coefficient corresponding to this beta 1, I have really only 2 observations over here, but over here I have 4 observations. I have double the number of observations, and that's what is getting reflected in this factor being half, uncertainty becoming okay, half for u. Okay. So this was the idea which Fisher came along with in 20s, and since then it has been picked up. So as I said initially, it was not at all clear that, look, this is really, is this the correct way or should we stick to this? So slowly over a period of time, people have have accepted this idea. Okay. Yeah. So
That is our interpretation that we don't have information.
yeah, no, it is 0 is, see, when I say 0, it is just after that scaling, but it's constant, right? The fact is, if it's constant, it's not changing, right? So effect of that variable will not be reflected in y at all for those runs. If I held something constant, I'm doing experiment, now by observing what I'm measuring, I cannot tell you what is the effect of this on that, because I didn't change it. I held it constant, right? So in these two runs, I held it constant. I did not change it at all. Okay. Only when I am going to change something, then only I can see how much does this affect some variable.
You also will have some effect.
Yeah, it will have effect, but how do you find out? So only when you change this, right? See, it's like doing experiment in, okay, in if you look at our regression. See, if we have been looking at this y and x plots in that mileage example and so on. Really, if you see what is happening in x, I am varying x. Sometimes x takes this value, sometimes x takes this value, sometimes this value, sometimes this value, sometimes this value, right? Only when I change it can I say, okay, how much is the effect in y? If for all the experiments, okay, for all the experiments I had kept x at the, let's say, the same level, x was always this, what will happen to my y? Okay, all the experiments, my x is always fixed over here, my y goes up and down, yes, but now why does it go up and down? Is it because of x or is it because of that epsilon alone? There is no way I can differentiate between the two. I mean, x is of course not changing, right now it is just epsilon. It has an effect. It has an effect in the sense that if I had held x constant at some other level, maybe the mean of y would have come down. Here the mean is over here, here the mean is over here, right? The spread itself is just now what you are seeing is because of epsilon, that error, right? But until unless I do multiple values of x, just by doing experiments at the same x, I will not be able to say anything. Okay. Other way to look at this is if you see what the regression coefficient means, just from so when you write y equal to, let's say, let me just say beta 1 x, ignoring other things. What is this beta 1? So what are the units of this beta 1 really? Okay. How do I interpret this beta 1? I can write beta 1. Okay. There are other things, okay, which are function of maybe, let's say, x1, maybe functions of x2 and error and intercept and so on. So really this beta 1, if you see, is nothing but the derivative of y with respect to x1, right? So I want to compute this beta 1, okay. How do you compute a derivative numerically? I will change x1 and see the change in y, delta y by delta x. Okay. If I am not going to change x1, I want to keep it constant, I will not be able to get this, right? It will have an effect, but what I am really looking is this derivative. My coefficient is actually telling me the derivative. If I change x1, how much does it change y? Okay. So that's what is happening in that one factor time. x1 is having an effect, no doubt, but you cannot extract it because you are not changing it. You are not perturbing your x1. Whereas in the other approach, all the 4 runs have you are changing both x1 and x2 in all the 4 runs. Okay. So we say that this factorial approach is more efficient because this factor decreases, and actually if the number of factors were to be more, here we had 2 factors, if I were to take 10 factors, then this gain will be even higher, I mean this reduction will be even more. Okay. It will scale as powers of 2. Okay. So this is this is the advantage of this factorial design over one factor at a time. One is Well, your efficiency increases, you are getting better information, or in other words you can say to get the same information I can do it with lesser experimental effort. Another thing which we will see is that because we are changing both of them together, you can obtain what is called as the interaction effect. See, if you see, if supposing my model were to be of this form, okay, see, let me put a intercept also. See, this is my one model. However, if I put, see, supposing I put an interaction term, what is an interaction term? I say, look, the model should have not just x1 and x2 alone, but also product of x1, x2. So this is called an interaction term. Okay. Now if you generate data and now you want to estimate, let's say beta 1, so let me just ignore beta naught, it does not matter, it is without any loss of generality I can ignore it, and also of course error is always there. If you now want to estimate beta 1, beta 2 and this coefficient beta 1, 2 as well, okay, you will not be able to estimate it if you are only varying x1 separately and x2 separately, okay, because there is no run when both of them have been varied together. So this particular quantity, okay, you will see that you will have a problem in estimating beta 1, 2, and you can see this in that coded variable. One of them is 0 at all the 4 runs. Essentially this product remains at 0. However, if you are varying both of them together, okay, you will also be able to estimate this particular coefficient beta 1, 2, which is called as the, this is the essentially characterizing the interaction between x1 and x2, how these two factors are together affecting your response variable y. Okay. So there is a possibility of obtaining interaction effects should you want to estimate them. Other thing is, because see, we say that our estimates have wider inductive basis, which means that whatever effects we are estimating, that beta 1 I am estimating, that has been estimated at different levels of the other factors. The other variables were also changing when I estimated this particular let us say effect of one factor. So I will get conclusions that are valid over a more representative range of experimental conditions. Whereas in one factor at a time, essentially I am getting those partial derivatives when other things were held constant. So I do not know what those derivatives will be when other things change. Okay. So it is not that representative. Fine. So this is sort of you can say hand waving arguments. Some of them are hand waving arguments about why this factorial design is better. Okay. Now to do some analysis, what analysis we can quickly do? Let us look at this particular example again, and now I am going to introduce one more factor. Okay. So the summary so far is that if you have some response variable y, in this case it was the cracking of springs, I want to find out which factors are affecting it. Okay. When I do experiment, I should not vary one holding others constant. That is not a good way. In fact, you identify a set of factors and then vary all of them together within certain range. Okay. That will yield in some sense the best possible data for you. Okay. That is the idea of factorial design. Okay. So you have done this experiment. Now what all can we extract? So now really we want to know, so see that, so again as I said, it looks counterintuitive. If you had just varied x1, then we are looking at this difference. What was the value of y for x1 equal to 1 and value of y for x1 equal to -1? I could have told you what is the effect if x1 increases by 1 unit, what is the effect on y. Okay. How do I extract that information when I am perturbing both simultaneously? So we will see that in the next few slides. Okay. So let us say to make it more realistic, we have added one more factor, and as I said, this is actually a simple version of an actual problem faced by a company. So let us say I have added one more factor which the engineer can vary. So one is the temperature of steel when the spring is immersed in oil, other is the carbon content of steel, and third is the temperature of this oil itself, that can also be varied. Okay, so there are three factors, and let us say for each of those factors you are given a range in which you can operate. This temperature is in this range, and because of our scaling we are calling this as -1 and this is +1. Carbon content is in this range, and this oil temperature is in this range, 70 to 120 degree Fahrenheit. you can operate it, vary it in this range. Okay. So you have three factors, and what you are going to do is you perturb. So in this factorial design, you say each factor I will increase or decrease. So there are two values. For each factor I have two values. So total I can have 8 combinations to the power 3, right? So you perform runs at each of those 8 combinations. Okay, you collect your response variable y at each of those 8 combinations. So if you see this particular run, all the 3 variables were at their lower level. In this one, the first one was at the highest, and these 2 were at the lower level. In none of them is any of these variables at 0. It has been changed in each of the 8 experiments. Okay. So this is the data you collect. Let's say this is the percentage of springs which crack for this experimental for this combination of variables. Fine. Now what analysis can we how do we find out the effect of the individual variables on the response variable, which is the cracking of springs, using this data? So unfortunately some part of my notes I didn't have time to type them, so they are scanned. It is available to you as in a handout. So let's say this is the representation of the experiment that you have performed in a cube. What is there in a cube? There are 3 axes. This is the temperature axis. Temperature can be at the lower value, -1, or at +1. -1 corresponds to this 1450, +1 corresponds to 1600. This axis is for the oil temperature, varies from 70 Fahrenheit to 90 Fahrenheit, and this is for the carbon content. I had 8 runs. Each run corresponds to a vertex in the cube. Fine. What you see in the boxes over here, I don't know if these are visible from the back. They are visible. Okay. There you also have the paper. The handout has been given to you. You can look at the numbers there in case there is any problem. So if you look at these boxes, this is the corresponding value of the y variable, the response variable. Okay. So you have 8. You have done 8 experiments. You have the corresponding responses listed in these boxes. Okay. Using this, can you tell me if I increase temperature from the low value of 1450 to 1600, what is the change in your y value? How will you tell that? So that's the question. Can you answer this question? Essentially, the derivative of y with respect to t. Okay. If I increase temperature from a low value of 1450 to a high value, what is that effect going to be? See, in that 1 factor time, I would have held others constant, only done one experiment where temperature was low, one experiment temperature was high. Based on the difference, I would have said, oh, as I increase temperature from this to this, y changes by this amount. Can I do the same thing over here? How do I estimate that effect? What is the effect? What is my estimate of the effect of temperature on the response variable y as temperature goes from low value to high value? Yeah, any suggestions? Yeah, yeah, you can think aloud. These ones, there are 2 data points at 1450, 1 and 3. Very good. Yeah, so that's you're thinking in the right direction. So even though in see there are 8 runs and the runs are labeled with this circles, run number. If you look at these 2 runs, what is the difference between 1 and 2? What has changed? Only the temperature. Other 2 values C and O, they were perturbed, but the perturbation was the same. So C was at the lower level in both these runs, and O was also at the lower level in both these runs, right? So the difference which I am seeing between 60, this yield, the cracking percentage, 67 and 79, this difference is only because of increasing temperature. So this difference, 79 minus 67, 12, gives me one idea of increase of temperature. However, there are several such pairs. This is one pair where only temperature was changing. What about 3 and 4? Again, only temperature is changing between 3 and 4. Now the C is kept at the higher level, O is still at the lower one. Okay, O is still at the lower, C is at the higher. But this difference, 61 to 75, is only because of temperature. Same way, I have two other pairs, 52 and 87, 7 and 8. The only thing that is changing between these two is the temperature. C was at the higher level for both, and O was also at the higher level. O is increasing in this direction as you go inside the board. O is also at the higher level at these two. So I have another difference which is just because of increasing temperature, and similarly between runs 5, which is on this vertex which is inside the board, and vertex 6. Okay. This difference again 90 to 59 is only because of change in temperature, because C was kept at low level, it is on the base of this cube, and O was at the high level, it is the wall inside, right. So I have 4 such differences which are caused just because of increasing temperature. Other 2 factors were the same for each pair of these values. Of course, they were kept at different values. So C was 0.5 here and 0.7 here. But the temperature effect, you have 4 estimates of temperature effect. If you average those, you get an average, you get some idea of what is the effect of increasing temperature on your response variable. Fine. So even though you are perturbing everything together, okay, you do have these pairwise, these pairs where only temperature was changing. Other factors were held at different levels. Okay. So that's what you can do. The difference between those pairs between y2 minus y1, y2 minus y1, y4 minus y3 and so on, you had these 4 pairs, 4 differences. If you take their average, okay, average turns out to be 23. So you can say that, okay, on an average, if I go from the lower value of temperature to the upper value, my variable changes by 23 units. Okay, response variable changes by 23 units. Fine. So even though when you did the experiment, you changed everything, you did not hold C or O at 0 constant at any point of time, you can still estimate the effect of temperature. Okay. This over here tells you the corresponding values of C and O for both these runs, y2 and y1. C and O were at this level. Okay. So you can get, so this particular quantity is called the main effect, main temperature effect. Okay. Okay. So this is, if you were to just look at this average again, this is that averaging. So you had y2 minus y1 and y4 minus y3 and so on. I have just written, and that those 4 differences divided by 4 to get an average. I have just written it in this form. I have just written them together. Now if you see what is really happening, I am adding 4 observations and subtracting 4 observations, y1 to y7, y1, y3, y5, y7, and I am adding these 4. And what is common between these 4? y2, y4, y6, y8. What is common between y2, y4, y6, y8? y2, y4, y6, y8. What is common between them? They correspond to the positive, the higher level of temperature. So out of these 8 runs, 4 of them are at the higher level of temperature, 4 of them are at the lower level. So all you are doing really is adding all those 4 runs which were at the higher level of temperature, subtracting the responses at the 4 runs which were at the lower level, and dividing by 4. 4 is essentially, you can say, the number of runs at which it was at the higher level. That gives you an estimate of the effect of increasing temperature from lower level to the higher level, the estimate of the effect on Y, right. So that's what you are doing. You are taking essentially this divided by 4 is the average of the responses at the higher level of the temperature, and minus the average at the lower level. Okay, that's 6 to 23 as the idea, as the estimate. Same thing now you can do for the other two variables, carbon content and oil temperature. See, all of this we can do via regression also. We can form that X matrix or A matrix and estimate coefficients, but this sort of gives more insight. And there is also a history behind this. This area developed independently of regression. Regression was more, you can say, more coming from academics, more it had more theoretical framework and a lot of theories involved. So a lot of pure mathematicians in fact were working in that area. This has essentially come from the reverse, from the industry side. People had problems and they were looking for quick solutions. Okay, how do I solve it? I can do some experiments. How do I quickly do experiments? So people who did all of this or who applied this in 60s, 70s in industry, I mean the practitioners themselves, they probably did not know anything about regression or confidence intervals or anything. They were just looking to solve their problem. Problem was, I want to minimize cracking. Okay, how do I do it? Okay, and that's where, with of course support from the statisticians like Box and Fisher and so on, this area developed. So it can, all of this analysis can be done. We can write down a model y equal to something plus a constant beta 1 into temperature plus beta 2 into O plus beta 3 into C. Okay, and I think there is a handout where you will see that equivalence also, the same derivations using the regression idea. Okay, but it helps to look at this point of view as well. Okay, without getting into formal regression model, we just want to find what is the effect of increasing temperature on the response. Right? The two are related, they are giving you the same information, but this is slightly different way of looking at the problem, and this is the ideally suited for practitioners because they don't want to get into, I mean, they probably will not understand, they will not have time also to understand all your notation X transpose X inverse and so on, but this you can explain to a layman. Okay, nobody needs to know statistics to just understand these ideas. So you can get the effect of temperature on your response. Same way, if you want to find the effect of increasing carbon content, again the same idea you can apply, right? There are these two runs where only the carbon content has changed. Again, this pair of runs, this pair of runs, this pair of runs. Actually, what you are doing is you are looking at this top plane, which are these 4 runs corresponding to carbon at the higher level. You add those, subtract the sum of these 4 runs where carbon is at the lower level, okay, divide by 4, which is the number of runs you have at the positive level of carbon. That will give you the effect of increasing carbon content from 0.5 to 0.7 on your response variable, which is the percentage of springs cracked. Fine. So in the temperature case, you are looking at the difference of, so what you are really doing, you had these 8 runs. To get the effect of temperature, you are really looking, you are adding these 4 runs on this side of this plane and subtracting the 4 runs, the response values at the 4 runs on this side of the plane. For carbon, you have, this is your positive plane and this is your negative plane. Okay. And for the third factor, it's not showing in this. Okay, it was difficult to plot it. So what I have done is put this plus, not the hashing. The hashing is over the plane which goes inside. This 7, 5, 6, 8. That's the positive plane, and then 3, 1, 2, 4 is the negative plane for this oil temperature. Okay, oil is higher at this level and lower at this level, right? So essentially, look at just add your responses at the corresponding at these vertices in the plus side. Subtract the values obtained at the vertices in the negative plane, divide by 4, you will get the effect of temperature, effect of, similarly for carbon, similarly for effect of oil, and these are called as the main effects. In regression terms, you are essentially doing y equal to beta naught plus beta 1 times t. So this main effect essentially is related to that beta 1. Your other term beta 2 times c, you are getting beta 2, and beta 3 times o, you are getting beta 3. Okay, these main effects are related to your coefficients if you were to fit a plane between y and temperature, carbon, oil. Okay. Okay, I think let's stop here, and after lunch I'll also tell you about interaction effects and some additional terms you can compute because we have performed this factorial design experiment. So we'll break for lunch, Sachin. Okay, I'll see you after lunch.